What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and we got another tournament report video because two tournaments actually happened this past week, and that's very exciting to see more and more of these old formats that we featured on the channel popping off in their respective Discord communities, in their respective tournaments. So very, very cool stuff here indeed. Now, the first of the tournaments that I want to talk about is the Treasure format tournament, and I think this was a pretty cool one. You know, Treasure is a format that's very, very early on in the game's history, October 2002, and as such, you know, you don't really see, like, super big meta shakeups, although I will say that, like, all the results from these Treasure tournaments have been very interesting. I mean, last tournament, we saw, like, more of a wrap box tomato, you know, sort of heavy recruiter deck fit in with Robin Goblins and things like that, and that was really, really interesting innovation there. And this tournament, you also see some innovation in the top cut. But before we dive into the top cut, I want to talk about the deck type representation. Now, these stats come from formatlibrary.com, and I'll be linking the coverage of both of the events that I'm going to talk about in this video in the description down below. Definitely check that out if you're interested in more in-depth numbers here. But as you see, you know, the chart for this format is sort of dominated by tomato control. 13 people were on tomato control out of a format with 17 people total. And so, you know, tomato control, very popular list, but I will say that the algorithm that sort of classifies things on format library, it can sort of group things together that play very differently. And you'll see that in the top cut. I think 2 out of 3 decks are classified as tomato control, and those 2 decks, I would classify them as doing slightly different things. You know, there are different focuses there. But in a lot of early Yu-Gi-Oh formats, you know, things are a bit more nebulous than you get later down the line when archetypes come around. So I do get why things are classified this way. But, you know, I think this does show that, like, there is a pretty heavy focus on sort of like good stuff decks that may have specialty here or there, but largely play the same core of cards. And that is something that you have to get used to if you want to play these older formats here. This does change eventually in the game's history, but in Treasure format, at least, it's still in effect. Some people are not bothered by that. Other people's are. So, you know, you got to just know whether it will bother you or not before diving into the format. But there were some other decks that were also brought. Empty Jar, someone brought that. I don't really think Mill is that good in this format, despite, you know, having high hopes for it when I first tested the format. But it's cool to see people still experimenting with it and bringing it. Soul Control, I think this deck is really bad because Soul Exchange into a Sangan or Witch is just awful. So, you know, kudos to someone for bringing it, but I mean, it's just kind of a rough deck to bring here. Recruiter Control, you know, this was the deck that sort of won the last format tournament, although I think it was classified as Tomato Control in that report. But either way, you know, Recruiter Control with, you know, tomatoes and potentially another recruiter as well. A very, very strong deck. And a deck that, you know, I expect to see more play in the future. One person playing this, maybe it's just a factor of, you know, other versions of the deck being classified as tomato control. But I do think that it still is a pretty good sign to see people still playing around with this deck. And lastly, we had Germ Burn, which is just sort of a burn deck. And that might not be pleasant to play against, but it is a powerful deck in this format, as we'll see when we dive into the top cut here. So, before going into top cut, I just want to talk about the deck category representation. I'm not the biggest fan of a chart like this, but I do think it does sort of give a general indication of how games play in this format. Mid-range is the way that this format plays out. So it's a bit more mid-range than like Critter format, which comes right before it. And I'll say, like, you could argue that this is really the start of when Yu-Gi-Oh formats sort of lean more towards mid-range style gameplay as opposed to just pure control style gameplay. But either way, you know, I think the gameplay is still relatively similar to Critter, even though it is a bit more mid-rangey with the tomatoes being able to preserve your board presence and things like that. So, you know, it's just interesting to sort of take a peek at here. But just know that a lot of the games in this format are going to feel pretty similar, even if you're up against decks that are maybe doing slightly different things. But that's going to do it for discussing the deck types and deck categories. Let's dive into the topping deck lists themselves. Firstly, in third place, we had Dump Truck, a frequent player in a lot of these tournaments. Very, very good duelist in a lot of these old formats. And, you know, they're playing a very, very good deck here. They're playing Tomato Control, but they're putting their own spin on it, you know. And I think that Tomato Control decks in Treasure format sort of go in a couple different directions that I've been seeing. One is playing Banishers in the main. This is a very interesting tech card. Basically, it banishes anything sent to the graveyard, so it turns off your opponent's Sangant and Witches. So if you use it right, you can deprive them of sort of the main resource engine for a lot of decks in this format, which is very, very strong, of course. And also playing Robin Goblin, which is another really good card to pair, especially with Banisher of the Light, but a card that people have been experimenting with more because, you know, even if your opponent just uses MST on Robin Goblin and just clears it right away, You could argue that it's still traded 1-for-1, so that's not bad. And also you could argue that like if they don't use an MST right away, it's going to take a lot more than one card from their hand. So very good card that has been seeing a lot more play in this format in particular. And, you know, just cool to see people experimenting with it more. And this is sort of like one direction that you can go with tomato control. And we'll see later on in the top cut the other direction you can sort of go. But I will say that, like, you know, besides that, I think the deck is pretty standard. You know, it's playing all the standard monsters. It's playing, you know, fishers. It's playing relatively standard stuff. So kudos to Dump Truck for making it third with a very, very interesting list with the Banishers and Robins. And I'm curious to see if people sort of adopt this strategy more going forward. Now in second place, we entered the no fun zone. Now I was the one that actually brought this deck to the tournament and made it to second place. The reason I did that was because I noticed that people hadn't really been playing much Chain Burn in the, well, not Chain Burn, I guess, because Chain Burn refers to like Chain Strike Burn, but you know, Chain Energy Burn. I guess it's referred to as Germ Burn on Format Library. But I noticed that people hadn't really been playing this deck in the tournaments, and it makes sense because this deck is like not really fun for your opponent. And also I will say, like, just playing this deck, like this deck is not really the playstyle that appeals to me. The reason for that is, like, I feel like it's very, very, I mean, it's not like linear in the sense that you'd think of as linear, but like you often have very few options for what to do, right? With a tomato control list, you often have a bunch of different options, right? You know, what are you going to search off tomato? Are you going to commit this monster or that monster? And are you going to bring out an attack or set it or what have you? In this list, like, while there are some decisions that you have to make, I'm not going to say this deck is easy to pilot by any means, because those few decisions you have to make are very, very important and can change the game from being a win to a loss or vice versa. I do think that, like, overall, this deck has a lot less decisions, and, you know, the games when you win, you're oftentimes just going to be able to win, like, pretty handily, and the games where you lose, you oftentimes just had almost no path to victory. So I'm not the biggest fan of that style of deck, but I do think this deck is still strong in the format, and because people weren't really playing it, I decided to play it, give it its sort of representation in the top spots. Now, I didn't expect to make it to the finals, but I actually did manage to make it there, so very cool. So I'd still say this deck is tier 1. It did win the first treasure tournament that we ever held on the YGO from Zero Discord server, but, you know, it hadn't really seen its time in the sun since then, and this topping finish definitely shows that it could potentially do better in future events as well. Lastly, for the winning deck list, we got GMYFS's version of Tomato Control here. And as you can see, it's pretty different from Dump Truck's list. No Banishers in the main, no Robin Goblins in the main. And there's a couple interesting tech spell cards that are very interesting. Last Will, definitely not a standard in this format. But, you know, if you run into like a trap hole or something, Last Will can be very good at just replenishing your board, getting out more monsters. And if you're playing Cannon Soldier already, you can also use that trigger Last Will as well, which is pretty good. Upstart Goblin, very interesting in this format. You know, not many people have been playing around with this card that much. And, you know, it is a good card. You know, it draws you a card, gets you one card deeper into your deck, so one card closer to good cards. But, you know, people haven't really been playing it because it's just like a deck thinner, and life points really do matter in this format a lot, more than deck thinning. So people haven't really been, you know, testing it out that much, but it's cool to see it in the winning list, and maybe the fact that it's in this winning list is a sign that the card is better than a lot of people have given it credit for. Solemn also in the main. Solemn's a pretty controversial card in a lot of these retro formats because, you know, life points do matter quite a bit. You know, in the modern game, Solemn is just a busted card, right? It's very, very clear why it's busted. But in the older games, you know, games would last a lot longer. And if you do drop down half your life points, your opponent can potentially just kill you out of nowhere with the remaining cards that they've got. So, you know, Solemn is definitely a card that, you know, sort of ebbs and flows in a lot of these formats. In Treasure, it's never really been like too popular, but, you know, cool to see it being experimented with here, and it clearly worked out well for GMYFS. So very, very cool stuff indeed. For the side, there's some interesting stuff as well. Triple Thunder Dragon and double card structure. Not really sure what this is really in here for, but, like, you know, it's still pretty cool. And, you know, maybe you'll experiment with this engine a bit more in the future. Double Banishers as well. I think Banisher does, you know, belong in the side if you're not playing in the main, because I do think it is a very, very good card against a variety of decks. You've got Cyber-Jar here as well. I think these three are mainly here for like recruiter strategies. But yeah, a lot of very cool stuff here. And yeah, congrats to GMYFS for winning the Treasure Tournament with this very, very interesting list. I'm curious to see if more people will adopt lists like this for Tomato Control or more lists like Dump Truck for Tomato Control. But only time will tell. Now, moving on to the next event, we had a Stein Format tournament wrap up in the YGO from Zero Discord server just the other day. I actually streamed the finals, and it was very, very exciting. Very, very cool games between some very, very good players. But I think the metagame for Stein is a bit more diverse than Treasure. So, and there were some interesting sort of decks that actually made it to Top Cut. And so I'm excited to talk about that. If you want to join in any future YGO from Zero tournaments or join in any Treasure tournaments as well, I've linked both the Discords where they happen down in the description below. So definitely head on over there if you want to play in future events. But the Stein Format tournament was pretty fun. There were 23 people total. And of those, 13 people brought Stein Monarch. Now, take that number with a grain of salt because just like with Treasure and Tomato Control, some things get lumped in with Stein Monarch, which, maybe wouldn't be considered Stein Monarch by either their creators or the community at large. So, take that with a grain of salt. But I do think a lot of people did bring some form of Stein deck because it's the namesake of the format. Stein very good here. The reason why it was emergency banned at the end of this format because it is just very, very overpowering if it's able to, draw well and everything turns out well for it. But, 13 people were up back and a lot of other people brought other things that sort of contest Stein a bit. 3 people brought Dark World. Dark World Burn won the Chaos Return format tournament, and Chaos Return and Stein are sort of like very similar. Of course, Stein didn't have Chaos monsters, so you can't play any Chaos decks in Stein, but you still have a lot of the Stein decks running around, and the reasoning being that, if Dark World Burn could win and Chaos Return, it can probably win in Stein. And I still think it can win in Stein, but, it topped in this format at least, and 3 people brought it, so that's pretty good overall. 2 people brought Other. I'm not really sure what the Other entails, but, it shows that people are still experimenting with wacky decks that can't even be classified by the algorithm here. 2 people were on Chainburn, and I will say both those players made it to the Top Cut, showing that Chainburn is a bit of a threat in this format. In previous tournaments, Chainburn had not really made it to the top levels of things, but, maybe over time, Chainburn decks get more optimized and stuff, and, potentially falls off people's radar, and so they're less prepared for it, and that leaves Chainburn to a path for victory here. Now, as a note, there were some sort of iffy ruling things that did happen with, some of the games in the Swiss for some of the Chainburn games that, maybe if things had turned out differently there, it could have turned out a bit differently in Top Cut. But I do still think that, the fact that decks managed to make it to Top Cut is a pretty good showing for the decks here in Stein format. Apprentice Monarch, also one player was on that. Very classic deck, but unfortunately did not really manage to convert for them. Warrior, one person was on that. But again, take this with a grain of salt and probably take Apprentice Monarch with a grain of salt as well. Because, some of the Stein Monarch probably could have been classified as these as well. And lastly, Stein OTK, just the pure Stein OTK person. One person brought it. Again, I think that it's a fine line between pure Stein OTK and Stein Monarch in terms of the algorithm's recognition of it. So take these with a grain of salt, but I do think it does show the dominance of Stein in this format, even though other decks can indeed compete. But going over the deck category representation, I feel like it's less useful here because, just showing a split of a variety of different things and multiple is the main deck category representation. I would say, though, that most of the time in this format, games go really quickly, right? Because Stein makes things very aggressive, and because you want to deprive your opponent of still being in Stein range, even if you're not playing a Stein deck, you want to beat them down as quickly as possible to get them out of that 5,000 life point threshold, and then oftentimes you've already set up enough aggressive pressure to just keep aggroing them to end the game. So I will say that I think that this format is just generally pretty aggressive, and which makes sense for a Stein format, which won't be everyone's cup of tea. I mean, Stein itself is not everyone's cup of tea. And if it's not your cup of tea, you can just play Chimeritic format, which is the next format that I'll be having a tournament in, and that we're already featuring on the channel and also on the YGO from Zero Discord server there. But still, some people like this more aggressive style of gameplay, and, different strokes for different folks. So if this sounds appealing to you, definitely join in on future Stein events and just head over to the Discord, look for Stein games as well, because I'm sure that you'll be able to find people to play it with you. Now, before diving into Top Cut itself, it's important to talk about a deck that bubbled here. Now, format library coverage is, just in the near past, I guess. It's been featuring a 9th place deck list along with the top 8 that made it to the actual top 8 itself. So, we won't look a gift horse in the mouth. We'll take our, sort of free peek at what people were playing here and see that, GBO was on an Apprentice Monarch build that didn't quite manage to make it to Top Cut, unfortunately. As I said earlier, it didn't quite convert, but still very, very cool to see some experimenting with this deck. I think the deck is not bad. Old Vindictive is a pretty good card to get off of Apprentice, which can allow you to get more aggressive. But you can also get things like Hand of Nephthys, which can go into Sacred Phoenix from Nephthys, which is pretty good. You can get Magician of Faith as well. There's a lot of different things you can get with it. And also, after you've flipped up that monster, you can tribute it for a Monarch as well. So very, very cool stuff here overall. Soul Exchange can also pair with the Hand of Nephthys, which is a nice combo with that. So very, very cool stuff from GBO here. Unfortunately, didn't manage to make it to the Top Cut this time around, but maybe next time this deck will do a bit better. Now we get into the first of the chain burn lists that managed to make it to Top Cut, piloted by Lalo8888. And, this is a pretty standard chain burn list. It's playing the standard stuff, playing Chain Strike, playing a couple monsters here, playing Tremendous Fires, Accumulate Fortunes, Jars, etc. Not really much to say about chain burn. It's just chain burn. You can watch my video on it if you want more details. But basically the idea is that you're chaining a bunch of cards. You're getting big burn damage off of chain links and stuff like that. You're using your monsters to deal additional burn damage or Morphing Jar to replenish your hand. And then you side into Stein Decay in games 2 and 3. Now, I will say, the Stein Decay side isn't perfect. You're just sort of hoping that you draw enough here to actually go into that. But you do occasionally run into situations where, your opponent has the Decree and you're still playing a large density of trap cards. So it doesn't quite work out for you there. You don't draw the PCD at the Stein Decay, and then your opponent out aggroes you a bit. But I will say that, if you can draw Stein Decay, your opponent's likely sided out of things like T-Roars or things like that if they're not sort of in tune to what you're going to be doing here. And you can definitely win the game off that. So very, very cool to see this deck in Top Cut. And also it's interesting because this went with a different direction than the other Chain Burn deck in Top Cut. But we'll get to that when we get to the other Chain Burn list. Next up, we got Food on Steinarch. And I mean, what can I say? It's Steinarch, right? Playing Stein, playing your Monarchs, playing Last Will to get out the Stein to go for big damage. Pretty standard stuff overall. I will say there's some interesting tech cards here. For instance, the Creature Swap plus Scapegoat is not necessarily a typical combo, but it does make sense. If you draw Stein late, then Creature Swap can still be used with that to give your opponent a very weak monster. Scapegoat can also be defensive. Yes, your opponent can go into Cyber-End Dragon, but oftentimes it does stop their OTK unless they're playing the full-on Stein OTK package with limit removals, Megamorphs, etc. So I think there's a very, very interesting list. Pot of Avarice here as well. Not necessarily a standard inclusion, but very, very good card if you can support it. And I'll just say overall, I think this deck is very good. So if you want a Stein Monarch list, you can definitely pick this up. Next up, we got another dump truck list here, this time in Stein format. And this is Stein, or not Stein. It does play Stein, but this is Dark World Burn. So the idea behind this deck is basically to just bring out your Dark Worlds and get in for a ton of damage. Now, most versions of the deck do play burn cards as well, which is why it's called Dark World Burn. But this list really chose to, sort of forgo that, saying, I'm playing Dark World Monarch, really. And, I'm just going to play a Monarch game plan, just get out my big guys. And actually, I don't need things like Dimension Wall or Magic Cylinder or, anything like that. I'm just going to beat you down with big guys. And it worked out well for them. They're also playing Double Decree in the main as well, which is a really good tool, I think, for both ensuring that if you do go for Stein, it goes through, and also just ensuring that, your big guys stay around for a bit longer than they might otherwise. Brain Conjure in here as well to take control of your opponent's big guys, to either tribute them off or just get in for more damage. And just, I don't know, I think this deck's very, very good overall. Playing the Avarice as well, just like Food did, so that's very cool too. And yeah, very, very cool deck. And it shows that you can definitely build Dark World in a couple different ways. Although I think most of the Dark World builds that do have success just focus on getting really aggro. But you can decide whether that aggro looks more like this one or more like a sort of burn trap build. Next up, we got Hoy on another Steinarch build, but as you can see, this one's very different from the one Food played. One of the big things here, triple instant fusion. Very, very interesting tech card here. You don't have Thousand Eye Restrict anymore, so you can't actually bring that out. But you do have enough fusion monsters to be able to bring out things as tribute fodder for a Monarch or things like that. You can also potentially just bring out like a Fiend Skull Dragon. So you just be like, you know what? I'm going to prevent flip effects or traps the target. And that can come up occasionally. You also have like Mariner, but this doesn't really do anything because, you can't attack with the monster. So it's just cool to have there. But either way, very, very cool stuff with that tech card there. Also, triple econ, I like that a lot, especially with like Treeborn or just with your instant fusion thing there. Snipe Hunter as well, not necessarily a typical choice, but I do get why it's in this deck. If you pitch something like Treeborn, that's pretty good. And just popping things can be pretty good if you're just going for damage. Of course, you can miss off this, but that's the risk you take when playing a card like that. But still very, very cool stuff. The Karibo in main, very, very funny for Stein format. Just, hard hitting that sort of, aggro OTK style deck that does abound in this format. New Doria here as well. Good tech card off of Tomato. So just a lot of cool stuff in this list. I don't really have too much more to say, but I think this does show that like there are multiple ways to build Steinarch, which is sort of seen as the best deck in the room right now, I'd say. But like there are different ways to build it. And, depending on your build, you can get different levels of success. Now we get to the other chain burn list in the top cut here, which is piloted by the Indie Experience and going for a bit of a different tack than the one that Lalo brought. No monsters in the main deck, which is very, very interesting. But, you know, they mentioned to me that this was actually a very interesting like tech choice for the format because they knew that Monarch would be big. And if you don't play monsters, the side is sort of rotten hand. You also make Zaborg a bit less good, although your opponent can just tribute set the Zaborg out at the end of their turn, or main phase 2 that is, and then flip it up on the following turn to get him for 24. But oftentimes that sort of arrests their aggressive pressure because they can't get an additional monster. So, you know, it can be a bit awkward for them there. But either way, you know, I think this was a pretty neat choice for how to build the deck. Very, very cool stuff there. Now, I will say there's some interesting choices as well, like Fire Darts, you know, really digging deep for cards that burn. And I did see a couple games that the Fire Darts sort of just had to land at the right things or else they would lose. But if they landed right, then they'd win. And they did indeed win on those Fire Dart rolls for the most part from what I saw. But, you know, it does mean that, like, it is a bit of a risky card. It can definitely have high reward, as it did for the experience here, but it could definitely also, you know, fall flat. But luckily for them, they managed to, you know, get the right rolls off that. And, you know, besides that, you've got a bunch of other burn cards here as well that deal guaranteed damage, so that's also kind of nice there. So very, very cool stuff indeed. Also, only one T-Roar, one Wuboku, which is kind of interesting as well. But, you know, again, if you're playing, you know, sort of around Sidra or Monarchs and things like that, then you don't really have to worry about, like, Monarch into Last Will into Stein as much, so you don't really need sort of to max out on these sort of battle faders. But very, very cool stuff from Indie Experience, and I'm curious to see how they continue to refine the list in the future. Next up, we got another Steinmark build from JCVD here, and this is a very, very interesting one. It's doing a bunch of interesting stuff. I think this is more similar to what you'd expect as like sort of a standard build, you know, incorporating a lot of the text that we've seen in previous tournaments, but to great effect, you know, because JCVD made it all the way to, you know, tied for third in the top cut. But some very interesting stuff here. Future Fusion, you can use this to send Sidras from your deck to grave and, you know, just potentially get a twin or an end without having to use the Cyber-Stein, which is very, very nice. Sure, your opponent can potentially pop it, but it deck thins for you, gets things in grave for like pre-mat if you want to do that. So still very, very cool stuff there. Unfortunately, you can't do anything that can send a Treeborn Frog, which would be ideal for the deck. But, you know, it is what it is. Limit removal also in the deck as well to pair with the Stein, as well as the Cyber Dragons, as well as the Takoichis. So, you know, a bit of an interesting card in the list. Definitely not standard by any means, but it definitely is a card that can come in clutch and potentially win the game. Jinza is also in this deck. I think this is a great card for Monarchs in this format because it does shut down traps, which can allow you to get in for your attack. If you're getting in for a Jinzo attack directly to your opponent, then you're potentially putting them out of Stein range. So that's very, very important. I like that a lot. Creature Swap also pretty good in this deck, even though, you know, you see that there's no scapegoat in this deck like Food had, but you can give your opponent a Treeborn Frog, you can give them a Stein, etc., and that can be pretty good overall. So, you know, again, not much to talk about here. Like Steinark does, you know, pretty much the same thing throughout whatever deck you've got it in. But I will mention that all the Steinmark lists that we've seen so far, I'm pretty sure, have all included Pot of Avarice, which is not necessarily a standard card that the deck would play in the past. So maybe something to consider for, you know, bringing this deck even further into the future in future events for the format. Now, finally, we get to the top two, the second place deck list by Transip here. Very, very interesting stuff. I mean, this is also Stein Monarch. You know, you see Mobius, you see the Zaborg, you see a Jinzo, you see Stein in there along with Last Will. So definitely a Stein Monarch build, but this is a 47 card Stein Monarch build, which is definitely not standard, you know. Most decks around this time, they want to play as close to 40 as possible, especially if you're playing Steinarch, because you want to draw into the pieces of your combo to, you know, make the OTK happen. But I do think that there is some merit to going above 40 in this format because, you know, you don't necessarily want a hard draw Cyber-Stein. You want to use Last Will to get it out. Now, you could argue that, you know, Last Will is unsearchable. So if you go up to 47 cards, then you're less likely to draw this. But if you're playing enough good stuff outside of that, then you might not even need the Stein OTK combo to actually pull things off. So very, very interesting ideas here, just stuffing as many good cards as they can, and it really did pay off for them in this tournament. I mean, they played this deck really, really well, made it all the way to the top two, and they played a very, very competitive, you know, sort of finals match that you can check on the channel. I streamed it the other night. But very, very cool stuff indeed. I wonder if this will get more people to experiment with going above 40 cards in these sorts of decks in the future. And lastly, for the winning deck list, we've got Jim Bob on a deck that was classified as Stein Monarch for some reason, despite playing no Stein and no Monarchs, but is more widely known as Warriors. And this shows that Warriors definitely does have a presence here. I mean, Warriors, you know, throughout this era, basically their toolbox deck. You use Rota to grab your warriors, get aggressive with them, and because they can get aggressive early on with their just, you know, sort of generic guys, they can potentially put Stein decked in a bit of a bind, because once you get them down below the 5,000 life point threshold, they, you know, really do have a tough time. I mean, not a terribly tough time, because they can still do Monarch stuff, but like, you know, you cut off one part of their deck, which is very, very important. And Warriors is a great way to do that. Very, very aggressive deck, very, very toolboxy. You can go into Mystic Swordsman level 2 or Sasuke, or, you know, Wildheart if you're afraid of traps. And Wildheart was definitely a card that Jim Bob sung the praises of. This card, very, very cool. Interacts with a lot of things in the meta in very interesting ways. And so definitely a thing that I could expect to see more experimentation of in the future. Another interesting point is the triple DD Warriors. This is a very, very interesting card in this format, but it makes a lot of sense. Deals with Treeborn very well, deals with Recruiters very well, deals with a lot of pesky cards for you really, really well. And, you know, yes, it, you know, can be cleared if your opponent just attacks it with something else. But if you're in a situation where you're giving your opponent, you know, just that choice to just attack into it and stuff, it's still clearing a monster. And ultimately, like, if you're that down bad to clear something with this, just by letting your opponent attack into it, then you probably really want to clear that monster. So I think this list is really, really cool. Very, very interesting innovation in terms of the tech cards that, you know, Jim Bob played here. And you can get more sort of insight into the list, you know, from Jim Bob's lips in the stream that we did the other night. So definitely check that out if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritties of this deck. Okay, before we wrap up the video, I just want to sort of make a tier list for Stein format. Now, there aren't as many decks on this tier list compared to some of the other format tier lists that I've made, and that's because I didn't really feature as many decks in Stein format as I have for other formats, you know? I feel like with other formats, I really wanted to go through every single thing you could do, but because Stein format was so similar to Chimeritic format, just with the inclusion of Stein, I felt like, you know, covering a ton of things that I was just going to recover in Chimeritic format, where they were more viable because Stein was gone, didn't really make much sense. So I didn't really cover too many decks here. So for the decks on this tier list, I largely restricted myself to decks that I made videos on, or decks that popped up in the tournament. There are other decks you can play in Stein format. Things like Bazoo Return were not really played in the tournament, but could probably be really good given how good it was in Reaper format. Yeah, there's a couple different things that you could play potentially beyond this. But this is what I'm going to do for my tier list here. You can add more files to the tier list if you want to. I'm going to link to the tier list down in the description down below if you want to, you know, make your own and, you know, sort of say, this is what I think Stein format looks like. But for me, these are the decks that I'm going to be ranking. Now, before diving into the tier list itself, I think it's important to, you know, sort of lay out what I mean by each tier, because this can change depending on the person you are. I mainly define these tiers based on tournament success. So tier 0 is if you're going to have a deck that will win every single tournament and also have most of the top cut representation in those tournaments, right? And so this means that if there's one best deck, but then there are other decks that can potentially like sort of you know, counter that deck and still wind up in top cut, even if that one top deck is sort of defined metagame. If it's not overwhelmingly the layout of the top cut for like every single tournament that you get, I don't classify that as tier 1 personally. I'd tier 0 personally. I would classify that as tier 1. It's just the best deck in tier 1. For tier 1, it's a deck that I think could win tournaments, you know, somewhat consistently. Like, I would not be surprised to see it win, and it will generally like always top as well. For tier 2, it would be a deck that I don't necessarily think can win a tournament, but it's a deck that I would not be surprised if it tops in a lot of events. So yeah, like tier 1 is basically the tournament winning decks. Tier 2 is the tournament topping decks. Rogue is if it could potentially top at some point. Like if you got a really, really good player and, you know, you just get matches that really, really go well for the deck, it could potentially top, but I don't really necessarily see it topping that consistently. And I definitely don't think it could win a tournament at all. Trash is just decks that I don't even think could top at all. I think that they really struggle just to win a single match, and so it's not really worth playing at all. Anyways, diving in from the start, you know, I think the best way to start is just by talking about the elephant in the room, the thing the format's named after, and that's Stein. Now, I use Stein to sort of represent the sort of heavy Stein OTK decks, but you could use it to represent Stein Monarch, or any deck that's like heavily focused on getting Stein out. I think it's tier 1. Stein OTK didn't make it into the top cut for this tournament, but Stein Monarch definitely did. And, you know, Stein OTK has won previous tournament. It's made it, you know, to second place in some of the more modern tournaments as well. So I do still think that Stein is tier 1, despite not like, you know, going all the way in this tournament for the Stein OTK deck in particular. But yeah, I'm putting it in tier 1, and I think that is appropriate for where Stein should be in this format named Stein format, you know. Stein Monarch, I think, is probably the slightly more consistent version of a Stein deck, and that also belongs in tier 1. I could definitely see this winning a tournament in the future. very, very good. It's won tournaments in the past as well. And so, it's just very, very dominant. Even if you don't get Stein out, you get the Monarch game plan there. So it gives you a bit of options, and it's just very, very powerful stuff. So I think that it definitely belongs in tier 1. Now, Warriors, I will put this here as well. I think that this is definitely in tier 1. I'm actually going to put it top of tier 1. That may sound somewhat surprising. Maybe it's recency bias because of the most recent event. But I do think that Warriors' consistency really does aid it over the course of a long tournament. Because if you're playing a much bigger tournament, keep in mind that the latest tournament that we had for this was 23 players, which is very, very small, especially for a top 8 cut. I think if you had a much bigger event, like 100 players or something like that, the consistency of Warriors would help you out more than the sort of like inconsistent but powerful OTKs that Stein Monarchs and Stein OTK can get. So I do think that Warriors does belong at the top of tier 1. That's my opinion on it. But we'll have to see how the format continues to develop. Maybe this will be proven wrong and Stein Monarch and Stein decks will just completely overwhelm it in the future, but I do think that Warriors is very, very good here and belongs at the top of tier 1. Moving on to Apprentice Monarch here, I'm going to put this in tier 2. I think that this is just a slower version of a Stein Monarch build, and because of that, I don't really think it's as good. So I think it's sort of an inferior version of regular Monarchs, but I'll put it in tier 2 because I do think that it could top, bubbled this time. But I definitely think in the future it could be, well, I don't know. There's arguments for Rogue as well, but I think that it is probably in tier 2, maybe bottom of tier 2 though. Next up, we got Chain Burn, and you might expect me to be putting this in tier 1 because you got 2 Chain Burn players in the top cut there. But based on my categorization, which is not just for this format, it's how I always rank these formats as well. So this isn't just to, sort of put Chain Burn in tier 2, but I'm going to put Chain Burn at the top of tier 2. The reason for this is I watched the replays of the Chain Burn decks in this tournament, and I played the deck myself, and I've, sort of seen the record of these decks. Both the Chain Burn decks that made it to top cut got there with a 3-2 record. Some of those games that were played in Swiss, for instance, I mentioned Fire Darts. Sometimes it came down to that, which could have gone either way. I also mentioned that there were some sort of ruling discrepancies in Swiss that, were kind of tough, and if they were caught, the Chain Burn decks probably would not have won that. So, based on that, I think that it sort of was kind of iffy that it did make it into top cut here. Not iffy, like I think that, the players who played Chain Burn definitely deserve to make it to top cut there, and the deck is very, very good, so I think it does, I think it will be in top cut a lot in future tournaments as well. But the thing is that this deck is just very, very inconsistent in my opinion. Yes, you do have hands that just winning the game, but especially after siding, it can be a bit awkward because you're really relying on the Stein OTK stuff to carry you there. And if you don't get that stuff and your opponent has the outs to your stuff, then you just lose hard, right? And I think even in game 1, just like the deck can sort of have performance difficulties where like it comes down right to the last moment and you really need to just draw that card to burn your opponent that last bit of damage before they kill you with their aggressive pressure. So I think that it is tier 2 for now. I don't think it'll be able to win any tournaments anytime soon. But, with further experimentation, further tournaments, maybe this will rise up in my rankings. But I do sort of see it as a deck that is more likely to top than to win. And I don't really think that it can win in the future. But, I'm sure that people will disagree with me. It's a deck that definitely has its fervent defenders. I personally just think it's in tier 2 right now. But if further results change my mind in the future, I can definitely update the list in the future. But next up, we got Dark World Burn. I think this is also in tier 2. I'm going to put it under Chain Burn here. Just because Chain Burn did slightly better in representation in this tournament than Dark World Burn did. But I do think the deck is very good. Won a Chaos Return format tournament, and that format and this format are relatively similar. So I think it could potentially win in the future, but I think it's more likely to top than to win, just like with Chain Burn. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. Next up, we get Heroes. I'm mainly putting this in because I featured it in a video, and I would say Heroes, it pains me to say, but I'm going to put them in trash here. And this is focusing on the hero decks that actually try and make hero fusions, not necessarily the decks that just try and turbo out Neos. That probably would be in Rogue. But because the version I featured in my video was a fusion version, I'm going to put it in trash because I think the fusion version of the deck is really not good. The boss monsters that you go into require too many resources and also don't do enough on field. And just every other deck can just steamroll you pretty much. So I'm going to put in trash, and I will also put in these sort of like FDK strats in trash. Like FDKs, I mean, they haven't been good for quite some time in the GX era, and I don't really think that they're that good in this format either. So I'm going to put that in trash tier there. And yeah, I mean, under Heroes for sure, because I think the FDK decks are generally a lot worse than the Heroes. But, if you wanted to, you could potentially remove Heroes up to Rogue and leave FDK in trash and like make this night sort of format thing where like every tier has a deck in it. And if I had extended this out to every single deck that you could potentially play in Stein format, these tiers would be a lot more filled. But I personally feel like this is a pretty good representation of the format as is. And let me know if you agree with me or disagree with me down in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this format, how it will change in the future, and whether this tier list is correct or not. But that's going to do it for the video. I hope that you enjoyed as always. If you like what you saw here, do all the YouTube stuff like comment, subscribe, etc. Also, big shout outs to my patrons, without which these videos couldn't be possible. So big shout outs to GMYFS, Dump Truck, Rinspin, Pork Chop Coon, Brendan Donker, and Tyler Compton. It means a lot that you all support me this way. Encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. Again, I hope you all enjoyed as always. Join the Discord, link in the description if you want to play in these events in the future. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero. I'm signing off.